Greg Feith. He is a former NTSB senior air safety investigator. And Greg, we know you've been following this closely. You sadly have had quite a bit of experience on these kinds of investigations. What's happening right now in these hours right after this kind of tragedy occurs?
Well, besides, of course, what we see on TV with the search and rescue operation going on, investigators are really bringing the process of investigation together. The NTSB in conjunction with the FAA, and then parties that will be assigned by the NTSB to assist in the investigation, which will include the military. All of these people who are going to participate in the process are beginning not only to come together, but initial information is being collected or at least secured, because there is volatile evidence that can disappear, especially electronic and that kind of thing. So the process of investigation has already started, even though search and rescue is still going on, and video and trying to get a handle on at least some preliminary information, radio communications, radar data, that can start to give investigators at least an idea, a pathway for the investigation.
Yeah, and Greg, with that radio communication and flight data, how quickly should they have some idea of what may have gone wrong here? Are we talking just a couple of minutes, a couple of hours?
When you look at the investigative process, unfortunately, we live in a society of instant gratification. We want to know now. Mm-hmm. The problem is that while things are obvious as far as evidence and radio communication and radar data, you have to understand what the backstory is, what was going on. I mean, there's a lot of questions to be asked. This was a military training flight. So were they in constant communication? Of course, they were probably talking to the tower controllers at Reagan National Airport. They were given instruction. They lifted off or may have been transiting through the area. Were they on night vision goggles? Did that restrict their vision? So now you have the military side. The commercial side, you have this RJ who basically, I pulled some data, and it looks like they were already established on final and were at an altitude of about 400 feet above the ground when the collision occurred. So the question is, where did the helicopter strike the aircraft? Because from the video, it looks like the RJ is already established on final, and that the helicopter flew into most likely the back end of the aircraft, because it doesn't look like there was any kind of evasive action taken by either pilot.
Greg, could you tell, by looking at this video, I mean, obviously we don't know yet, but there are lots of questions. What do you see in that video that perhaps the layperson may not understand?
Well, again, because it is, a video shot from far away. If you look at the very bright light, that is presumably the RJ. When you're on approach coming into any airport, in this case, Washington National, you have all of your landing lights on. That's for visibility, especially at night. So when you look out, you know that, okay, there's an aircraft, rather than just trying to see the red and white position and the red, white, and green position lights. So you have the landing lights on. The brighter light is presumably the RJ. The smaller light moving from left to right, looks like a strobe, is presumably the Black Hawk helicopter. And you can see that there is no evasive action. It doesn't look like there's a change in position of the Black Hawk, and there definitely isn't a change in position of the regional jet. Now, there is some preliminary air traffic control chatter, radio communications that somebody has pulled down and sent to me. It hasn't been validated, but it does sound like maybe the military aircraft pilots were told to pass behind the regional jet. That, if that is true, then the question is, how did they really misjudge their position relative to the regional jet? And were they wearing night vision goggles? What was their purpose and mission? Where were they looking? All of these are going to be questions that hopefully can get answers, either from the flight data recorder and or the cockpit voice recorder on the regional jet, and then through air traffic control communications in general.
Hey, Greg, just a quick follow-up to what you just shared with us. Based on what we're seeing and what you just said, it does not sound like that the pilots of that regional jet had a lot of time to react.
And again, that's why after all of the search and rescue activities are done and victim recovery is conducted, the next step is wreckage recovery and trying to understand collision angles. How did each aircraft, what position they were in at the time of the collision? If the helicopter hit from about midpoint aft of the regional jet, there's no way that the pilots of the regional jet would have ever seen them. They would have never known anything was about to happen until it did. One of the questions, of course, is, well, there's traffic collision avoidance systems on aircraft. That is true for all commercial aircraft, jets, light jets, even general aviation airplanes to an extent. The military doesn't necessarily have that type of equipment on the aircraft because they have a different mission. So the question that I would ask as an investigator of the military is, what are your procedures, especially operating in an environment where we have high-density traffic flow? You're mixing commercial and civilian operations, civilian and military operations in this corridor. I grew up here in Maryland, so I'm very familiar with the area. I've lived there most of my life. I've seen these operations. I've flown down the Potomac River. It is busy, and you're constantly listening for other aircraft on frequency to see where they are and where they're going. Just because it's all about this term that we use in aviation called situational awareness. I want to know who's in my environment. The question is, was there that kind of communication, interaction between military and civilian? And then, of course, where were the controllers? Because the controllers do have a collision avoidance system. What's their responsibility for monitoring traffic in that vicinity, given the fact that we have a mix of military and civilian?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that earlier, Greg. Why would this military aircraft have been going through such a busy airspace? Obviously, we know that the Joint Base Anacostia Bowling is near the airport, but considering the traffic here, this seems like a recipe for disaster.
Well, when you look at the altitude, typically there are low-level altitude blocks for, in this case, helicopter operations, because you don't expect to have any kind of civilian aircraft, especially going into Reagan National, being, at 200 feet or 100 feet above the water like a helicopter can fly. And we know every day that the military, in some way, shape, or form, are running patrols up and down the river. Police helicopters fly low level, but the flight corridors, the approach paths for all of the runways there are typically higher, 400, 500, 600 feet. These guys were less than a mile. They're from at least the crude data that I've been able to pull down where these aircraft struck. It's about 4,500 feet horizontally from the end of runway 33, so less than a mile. So, of course, the regional jet's going to be low because they're approaching the runway, and it looks like the helicopter was level in its flight path as it collided. So all of these things, and we've operated like that for a very long time in that area. Yes, there have been some near midair reports and that kind of thing, but for the most part, it's a very structured airspace. The question is, was everybody doing the things they needed to do for operating in that airspace at the time?
Greg, you hear me? This is Topper, meteorologist Topper Shutt. A question now, and this is something that I'm just throwing out to you. Is it possible that the helicopter was below the radar and that's why the avoidance system didn't work?
Well, Topper, the big thing here is, civilian aircraft have a transponder. That transponder puts out a discrete code or a generic code. If you're general aviation, it all depends on the type of flight operation and your contact with air traffic control. In this case, the CRJ would have been on a very discrete transponder code. That code is an electronic signal. The air traffic controller picks it up on radar, and that particular code has a data tag to it. So it identifies, in this case, it would identify the aircraft flight number by flight number. It would have a ground speed and an altitude tag to it. If it's TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, and I'm in my airplane reads that same data tag, and I can now see my position relative to that airplane. Military aircraft don't necessarily have the same equipment. They don't necessarily operate or use, or have to use in some cases, a transponder. So they should show up as what's called a primary target, where it's really a skin paint. The radar spins, it blasts out its signal. The return signal is, yes, there's something out there, but it is not specifically identified. That is going to be part of the investigation. Was the controller aware of the position? Were they watching that? Was it identified as just a primary? And was somebody watching the collision avoidance? Because, again, there is a collision avoidance aspect to this in the tower at Reagan, as well as in the cockpit of the regional jet.
And I guess, I think you mentioned this earlier, that, I mean, there was no way the jet could have taken any kind of maneuver to avoid the, I mean, he was on final approach, which say 400 feet above the ground. That's it. I mean, he can do a touch and go, but he can't do a midair maneuver. The only possibility would have been the helicopter could have maybe avoided it, but I don't see how the jet could have, correct?
Well, it's too early to tell, because, again, if the helicopter struck the back end of the aircraft, then the pilots in the regional jet would have had no possibility of knowing what was happening behind them. If the helicopter was passing in front of them or approaching from the left or from the right at an angle that would have put the aircraft in front of the pilots, then you would expect that they would just naturally try to take some sort of evasive action. They may have still collided. And we've had mid-air collisions like that where the aircraft had approached and actually struck the front end of each aircraft, and the pilots tried to take evasive action. But when you look at the video, it doesn't look like either the helicopter or the regional jet are moving off their flight path in a very dramatic way that we would characterize as evasive action.
I guess what I'm saying is, had he taken evasive action, I don't think he could have kept the plane in the air, is what I'm trying to say. When you're on that last part of your approach and you're that low, I mean, you could probably swerve, but I don't think you're going to be able to land the plane anywhere else, correct? He would have gone down.
No, again, evasive action is a very generic term. If I know that the aircraft is approaching and I know that it's going to be lower than me, then I'm going to power up and pull up. I may bail off and try and roll the airplane to the left or the right to avoid the collision. Same with the helicopter. If it caught their eye at the last minute, they may have tried to roll the aircraft to the left or to the right. Doesn't mean they're going to dive into the water immediately. The evasive action is left or right or up and down.
So, Greg, you have this huge passenger jet. If you're talking about this military helicopter just, going in front of the jet, I mean, how do you miss something like that, even though it's so dark out?
Well, again, that is going to be, I think, one of the first questions that really needs an answer is, what were the actual positions? They'll be able to look at the radar data, and hopefully the military aircraft is either squawking the transponder code with a tag, or even if it comes back as a primary target, they'll be able to see, just based on the flight path of both aircraft, how this accident at least started as far as the sequence of events. Because if it looks like the helicopter was trying, or at least positioned to pass behind the regional jet, then you have to look at, well, what were the military pilots looking at that they didn't see this aircraft that they were approaching? You can then say that the RJ pilots would have never known that the helicopter was trying to pass behind them, other than maybe an air traffic control communication that they either overheard if the military pilots were on the same frequency. So there are a lot of questions just with that one aspect that can shed some light and really give a path for the investigation. And that's why radio communication, radar data, and then the recovery of the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Because, again, the cockpit voice recorder, you may have the pilots who, are flying. They're doing their, last-minute checklists. They're getting prepared to touch down, and then something catastrophic happens, and they don't know what's going on other than the fact that they've lost control of the aircraft.
Greg, before we let you go, I can't let this moment leave us. It's been 3 hours almost to the moment that the explosion happened, indicating there was this awful midair collision between the passenger jet and the Black Hawk helicopter. 3 hours of this search going on to find any survivors. Tell us about the reality of this now in terms of finding anyone alive.
Sure. It is a painful, agonizing experience for family and friends of not only the passengers and crew on the RJ, but of course the 3 military personnel. Even from an investigator standpoint, as an accident investigator, you're seeing the worst side of aviation. That was my job, and that is the job of the NTSB investigators that are going to be working this accident. We see that as tragedy. We know that we have to do our job. We have to be thorough and methodical so that we can provide answers not only to the family and friends, but to the public, to the aviation industry, so that we have these lessons learned so that tragedies like this don't happen in the future. We have to determine, was this a one-off? Was this an isolated event? Or is this a systemic problem? And you've reported it on your air over the years. There's always been a discussion about why not close Reagan? Because there's so many airplanes, there's a lot of traffic going on, and of course you got all the other issues of noise and curfews and everything else. It's a convenient airport for the people that work on the other side of the river. It's been a very safe airport because we have different kinds of policies and protocols and procedures that as pilots and operators in and out of that airspace has made it safe. But the fact is that in this particular instance, what was the flaw? What didn't work this night at that time? And I know for the families, it is agonizing. Of course, the search and rescue process is cumbersome, especially at night. You can only put divers in the water in certain areas under certain conditions. You don't know what's under there. They're going to be, the aircraft or both aircraft are underwater. There are traps, there are hazards that they can't really navigate at night. That slows the process down. And it is a painful experience, even for investigators. Because, again, it's my job to try and figure out what happened with a team and then at least, provide some level of comfort that here are the facts and this is what we know happened. Unfortunately, we can't bring your loved one back, but through the process, we're going to make it safer to fly tomorrow. And while that doesn't provide a lot of solace to the families of the victims, the process does work. And if you look at the history of the NTSB and early days of CAB, where the accident investigation process really started, you see how we've improved aviation safety over the years. And, when you look back at the last major accident, we lost, a A300 Airbus in New York in 2001, November of 2001. We had 2 regional aircraft go down in 2006 and 2009. But we haven't had a major accident in these United States where we've had a major loss, hull loss is what it's termed as, and a large catastrophic loss of life. we've got a very safe system, and what we can do is improve on that safe system.
Yeah, and so sad it takes these moments like we're seeing right here before we make any drastic improvements. As you mentioned there, Greg, we've been warned about the dangers here, the airspace around Reagan National for quite some time. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Former NTSB Senior Air Safety Investigator Greg Feith, thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate his
Good.
experience and his humanity as well.